They used to call me the hammer of justice until the day a rotten system made me quit. Now, I'm back in a courtroom, facing the judge's gavel, because my son is hiding bruises under his long sleeves, and I know the only justice he has left is me. The day I walked away from it all, I made a promise to myself I'd never go back. It was a solemn vow, made in the quiet of my own conscience, a line drawn in the sand of my own life. But promises, I've learned, are brittle things when a life you created is at stake. And so, here I am, sitting in a hard, polished oak bench that feels both alien and intimately familiar. I see my son, Ethan, a man who once effortlessly hoisted 80-pound bags of concrete, now struggling to his feet with the help of a crutch, his gaze perpetually aimed at the scuffed toes of his boots. And across the aisle, his wife, Chloe, whispers to her lawyer, a thin, predatory smile playing on her lips. When the judge brings the heavy wooden gavel down, the sharp crack doesn't just echo off the high ceilings. It feels like a physical blow, a shockwave that travels up my spine and awakens something I thought I had buried 15 years ago. Hello, everyone. My name is Frankie. Thanks for tuning in. I'm sitting here in my old Ford pickup, right outside the county courthouse, the engine ticking as it cools. The air smells of asphalt and cut grass from the municipal lawn. If you're out there listening, maybe in your own garage while tinkering with an old engine, or on the long drive to a job site before the sun is fully up, let me know where you're hearing this from. In times like these, it's a small comfort to know you're not entirely alone. When I finally stood, the old joints in my knees protesting, and my voice, rough from disuse in such a formal setting, filled the space. Frankie Parker, representing the defendant, Your Honor. A current of surprise rippled through the room. It was more than surprise. It was a collective intake of breath, a suspension of the normal courtroom hum. I could feel the weight of Judge Morales' stare from the bench. He knew me. Not just the name, but the history that came with it. He knew I had shed that skin, that I had walked out of this world and never looked back. But he couldn't possibly know the raw, paternal instinct that had dragged me back into it. Chloe's head snapped around. Her practiced, sympathetic smile, the one she'd been giving the bailiff, didn't just vanish. It shattered, leaving behind something cold and hard. For a fraction of a second, her mask slipped entirely, and what I saw in her eyes wasn't shock. It was a flash of pure, unadulterated hatred. It was the feral glare of a cornered animal. She had built her entire strategy around the assumption that I was a relic, a quiet old man content to spend his days in a wood shop, smelling of sawdust and varnish. She had counted on my son's silence, on his shame. She believed, with the absolute certainty of a bully, that Ethan would simply absorb the blows, sign the papers, and let her strip him of his home, his dignity, and his daughter. But she made a critical miscalculation. She doesn't understand the quiet stubbornness of men like us, the generation taught that you don't complain, you just endure. You can knock us down, sure. You can grind our faces into the dirt. But you should never, ever make the mistake of assuming we're going to stay there, especially when it's our own blood you're trying to harm. The first tremor, the first sign that the ground beneath my son's life was unstable, happened about 6 months ago. It was a Sunday afternoon in early fall, one of those perfect days where the sky is a deep, cloudless blue and the air carries the first hint of winter. I'd smoked a rack of ribs all morning, the way Ethan likes them, with hickory and a dry rub. I pulled up to their house, the one Ethan had poured his own sweat and blood into, and Chloe met me at the door. She was a picture of wifely devotion, all bright smiles and warm greetings, telling me how wonderful it was to see me. I stepped inside, the familiar smell of their home, a mix of lemon cleaner and Lily's crayons, seeming normal on the surface. But something was off, an undercurrent of tension I couldn't quite name. I found Ethan in the kitchen, fumbling with a stack of plates. His movements were clumsy, pained. He was already on the crutch then, the official story being a slip and fall at a construction site that had shattered his ankle. He reached for the cabinet, lost his grip on a steak knife, and it clattered to the floor. As he bent down, a difficult, awkward motion, the long sleeve of his favorite flannel shirt slid up past his elbow. It was for no more than a second, but the light from the kitchen window was unforgiving. There on his bicep was a bruise, a horrific mottled thing. It wasn't the simple black and blue of a common bump. It was a deep, violent purple, fringed with a sickly yellow-green, and it had a strange, almost linear pattern to it, as if made by an object. He saw my eyes lock onto it. Instantly, his face flushed a dark, painful red. He yanked the sleeve down with a jerky motion, turning away to busy himself with the knife, his back rigid. But it was too late. Our eyes had met. And what I saw in his gaze wasn't physical pain. It was a shame so profound it was like a physical presence in the room. It was the deep, soul-crushing humiliation of a man who prided himself on his strength, now a victim in the one place he was supposed to be king. I didn't have the facts, not yet, but a cold dread, heavy and sharp as a shard of glass, lodged itself deep in my gut. That house had been Ethan's masterpiece. He'd bought it as a condemned wreck, and over 2 grueling years of weekends and evenings, brought it back to life. I remembered him calling me, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and pride, after he had finally set the last roof truss. He knew every stud, every joint, every inch of that place. It was more than a house. It was the physical manifestation of his competence and his independence. But sitting in their living room that day, surrounded by Chloe's cold, minimalist furniture, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the thermostat. She chattered on about their finances, about how we needed to consider selling to cover his mounting medical bills and make ends meet. She deployed the word "we" like a smokescreen, but her plans were all about I. Ethan just sat there, silent, his hand gripping the worn foam handle of his crutch so tightly his knuckles were white. The house, once his proudest achievement, had become his prison, and I was beginning to suspect, with a certainty that made me sick, that it was also the scene of a crime no one was reporting. The family photos on the wall seemed to mock me, snapshots of a happy life that now felt like a carefully constructed lie. He's a burden now. I heard the words drift down the marble-floored hallway of the courthouse during a preliminary hearing. Chloe was speaking to her lawyer, Jennifer Rivers, in a low, conspiratorial tone, confident that no one else could hear. A man who can't walk, can't work. What good is he? Each word was a perfectly polished stone of contempt, and each one hit me like a physical blow. I was standing behind a thick pillar, and my hands, of their own accord, clenched into fists so tight my fingernails dug into my palms. In my years as a prosecutor, I'd listened to hours of testimony detailing the worst of human behavior. But I had never heard anything so fundamentally cruel. It wasn't just an insult. It was a complete and total erasure of a man's worth. She was stripping him of everything, his physical strength, his financial independence, and now his very identity as a man. The most sickening part was the realization that this wasn't the first time he'd heard those words. This was just the first time I had. The drive home was a blur. The familiar roads of my town felt foreign. My mind kept drifting back to Mary, my wife. She's been gone 10 years, but in moments like this, her presence is so strong it's almost tangible. Mary was the gentlest soul I've ever known. She believed in kindness as an active force, something that could heal and bind people together. She was the architect of our family, laying a foundation of trust and safety that I was supposed to maintain. Seeing what Chloe was doing, this calculated campaign of cruelty, felt like a personal failure, a betrayal of the legacy Mary had entrusted to me. I could almost hear her voice, a memory from a long-ago conversation when I was consumed by a difficult case. She had touched my arm, her way of grounding me. "Frankie," she'd said, "your job is to bring justice to strangers, but don't you ever forget that the most important justice starts right here, in our own home." The memory was a comfort and an accusation. That night, sleep was impossible. Mary's words echoed in the darkness, not as a gentle reminder, but as a direct command. I didn't storm back to the courthouse. I didn't hire a private investigator, not yet. My first move was a retreat. I went down to my woodshop in the basement, my sanctuary. The familiar, comforting smell of pine shavings and motor oil always helps me think. I took out my father's old Stanley hand plane. It's a beautiful tool, heavy in the hand, a solid block of cast steel and smooth, age-darkened mahogany. I clamped a rough-sawn piece of oak to my workbench and began to work. The blade made a soft, satisfying shh sound as I pushed it along the grain, peeling away translucent curls of wood. I wasn't trying to build anything. I was just seeking the rhythm, the focus, the feeling of control, the act of taking something coarse and flawed and making it smooth and true. It struck me then that the problem with Ethan was just like this piece of wood. Chloe had created a polished, perfect surface for the world to see, the doting wife, exhausted but stoic. But I knew with a craftsman's certainty that beneath that veneer lay the truth of the material, the hidden knots, the treacherous changes in grain. And if you were patient, if you applied steady pressure and knew what to look for, you could expose them. That night, under the single bare bulb of my workshop, I made my decision. I would be the craftsman. I would patiently plane away her lies until the ugly, raw truth of the wood was revealed. I would not stand by and watch my son be sanded down to nothing. I began with the mundane, paperwork. I went over to Ethan's under the pretense of helping him sort through his mail, saying he needed to keep his leg elevated. He resisted at first. That stubborn, ingrained pride of a man used to handling his own affairs. But he was worn down, and he finally relented. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. Tucked inside a stack of circulars and catalogs were the official envelopes, the ones with the little clear windows, bright red, angry-looking letters, past due notices from the power company, a shut-off warning from the water utility, a final notice for the county property tax. They were months behind, but the real story was on their bank statements, which I convinced him to let me review online. While the essential bills were being ignored, the debit card was working overtime. Weekly cash withdrawals from ATMs at the casino across the river, charges from fancy downtown restaurants where a single meal cost more than their electric bill, purchases from high-end boutiques. Chloe had been feeding him a steady diet of lies about how tight money was, blaming his medical co-pays and prescriptions. The numbers on the screen told a different, much uglier story. It was a story of methodical, remorseless theft. She was living a life of secret luxury, funded by the pain and disability of the man she had vowed to care for. A few days later, I decided to drop by unannounced. I found Ethan in his armchair in the living room, his face a mask of strained frustration. His crutch was lying on the floor, but it was a good 10 feet away, on the far side of the coffee table, a deliberate obstacle. Chloe was on the sofa, casually painting her nails, the chemical smell of the polish sharp in the air. She looked up when I came in, her face a perfect portrait of feigned surprise. "Oh, honey, I am so sorry," she cooed, her voice dripping with insincerity. "I'm just so scatterbrained today, I must have left it over there." It was a masterful performance, but I saw right through it. It wasn't forgetfulness. It was a precise and calculated act of psychological warfare. It was in the same category as the time she'd accidentally fumbled his bottle of prescription painkillers, sending them scattering into the sink and down the drain, or the time she'd forgotten to plug in his phone, leaving him isolated and unable to call for help. Each act, small in itself, was a powerful message. You are helpless. You are weak. You depend on me for everything. She was using the very concept of care as a weapon, systematically dismantling his self-esteem, one cruel little act at a time. I knew then that my own instincts weren't enough. I was too close, my vision clouded by anger and love. I needed a professional. I needed Vinny Costello. Vinny's a retired police detective turned PI, a man who has spent 40 years looking into the dark corners of people's lives. We met at a greasy spoon diner off the interstate, a place fueled by burnt coffee and regret. I didn't need to give him a long speech. I just laid it out. The bank statements, the timeline of the accident, a recent photo of Chloe. Vinny listened, his seen-it-all eyes never leaving my face. He took a long drag from a cheap cigar before speaking, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Frankie," he said, exhaling a cloud of smoke, "you know as well as I do, these things never end pretty, but I'll get you the truth." When he walked out, leaving the scent of stale smoke hanging in the air, I felt the first glimmer of hope. The burden was no longer mine alone to carry. Vinny was fast. The call came 3 days later, late at night. "I got something for you, Frankie." He had found him. Chloe's accomplice. His name was Rick, a small-time con man with a record that included fraud and a domestic assault charge. He was the missing piece of the puzzle. The file Vinny handed me in a thick manila envelope was filled with grainy photos of Chloe and Rick meeting at a seedy motel on the edge of town. It contained cell phone records, copies of financial transactions. Their plan was as simple as it was evil. Rick was feeding off the money Chloe was bleeding from Ethan's accounts. The end game was to pressure Ethan into selling the house. Then Chloe would take her half pound of the proceeds, cash out his insurance policy, and vanish with Rick. The evidence was irrefutable. Her cruelty wasn't an emotional outburst. It was a business strategy. My son wasn't a husband she'd grown tired of. He was an asset to be liquidated. I sat in my truck for what must have been an hour after leaving Vinny, the heavy envelope on the passenger seat feeling like a lead weight. Our generation of men, we were raised on the gospel of self-reliance. You're the provider, the protector, the rock. You handle your own problems, and you do it quietly. The idea of admitting you're being hurt, especially by the woman who's supposed to be your partner, it goes against every fiber of that upbringing. It feels like a fundamental failure. Listening to this, have any of you ever felt that pressure? That constant need to project strength to the point where you hide your own pain so nobody thinks less of you? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. Drop a line in the comments if you're so inclined. My granddaughter Lily is the light of my life. At 8 years old, she still sees the world as a place of wonder, and she absolutely worships her father. One afternoon, I took her for ice cream. As she was reaching for her cone, I noticed a thin red scratch on the back of her hand. I asked about it casually, not thinking much of it, but she flinched, pulling her hand back as if I'd tried to strike her. I fell, she stammered, her eyes suddenly fixed on a crack in the pavement. I've interrogated enough people in my life to recognize evasiveness when I see it. I didn't push. Later, though, she started telling me about a new game her mom played with her dad. She said Mommy would sometimes hide Daddy's crutch, and he would have to crawl around the room to find it. She described it with a child's innocence, but her voice was tight with an anxiety she couldn't articulate. She knew the game was wrong. She knew it was cruel. Chloe wasn't just torturing Ethan. She was twisting her own daughter's mind, forcing her to be a silent witness, a confused and terrified accomplice to her mother's sadism. The night it all came to a head was a Tuesday. The phone rang just after 10. It was Chloe, her voice a high-pitched theatrical shriek. She said Ethan had slipped in the bathroom, that he'd fallen badly. The emergency room was a chaos of controlled panic and the smell of antiseptic. I found Ethan in a curtained-off cubicle, his wrist already in a splint. The young doctor on duty, a kid with exhausted eyes who looked like he hadn't slept in a week, pulled me aside. "Mr. Parker," he said, his voice low and serious, "the fall can explain the distal radius fracture. What it can't explain are the multiple contusions on his back and legs. They're in various stages of healing." He paused, letting the words sink in. Several of them show a distinct linear pattern consistent with being struck by a long, rigid object. Furthermore, his X-rays show an older, improperly healed fracture on a floating rib. He didn't have to say the word abuse. His medical report was a formal, undeniable accusation. My gut feelings now had a clinical diagnosis. The next day, with Ethan and Chloe still at the hospital dealing with discharge paperwork, I used my emergency key and went to their house. I had to know. A cold, methodical calm had settled over me. I walked straight to their bedroom. The room was immaculate, the bed perfectly made, an artificial serenity that was more disturbing than messiness. I went to Chloe's closet. I pushed aside her expensive dresses and neat rows of shoes. Tucked in the far back corner, hidden behind a stack of old shoe boxes, was an aluminum Youth League baseball bat. It was small and light. It wasn't a piece of sporting nostalgia. The grip was scuffed and worn. I ran my fingers along the barrel and could feel faint, almost imperceptible dents in the metal. I stood there, in the silence of that room, holding that bat, and a cold wave of nausea rose from my stomach. This was it. This was the long, rigid object. The image formed in my mind, vivid and sickening. My son, trapped and helpless, and his wife standing over him, this thing in her hands. It's a vision that will be burned into my memory until the day I die. When Ethan was finally settled back at home, propped up in bed with a new cast on his arm, I went to see him. I went alone. I left the bat in my truck. I pulled a chair up to his bedside. The air was thick with everything we weren't saying. "Ethan," I began, my voice preternaturally calm. "I spoke with the doctor. He told me about the other injuries, the ones that weren't from your fall in the bathroom." He wouldn't look at me. He just stared out the window at the bleak gray sky. The clock on his nightstand ticked, each second a small metallic punctuation mark in the heavy silence. Finally, he spoke, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. "Don't say anything, Dad. Please. I can handle it." That old refrain, that mantra of male pride that was slowly killing him. I reached out and put my hand on his shoulder. It felt bony and frail under his t-shirt. "No, son," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "Not this time. You don't have to handle this alone anymore. I'm here." And that was all it took. The walls he had built around himself crumbled. Silent tears began to stream down his face, the kind of tears a man cries only when he has reached the absolute end of his endurance. The silence of shame was finally broken. Right before the first official court date, Chloe made her most audacious move yet. She locked Ethan in their bedroom. She took his phone and his crutch, telling him through the door that he needed absolute rest and quiet, and that she would handle the lawyers. It was a brazen act of false imprisonment, a desperate, last-ditch attempt to break him completely to ensure he couldn't testify. When I arrived to pick him up and found the door locked from the outside, the simmering rage I had carefully contained for months finally boiled over. I didn't waste time calling the police. I put my shoulder to the door and slammed my weight against it. The old wood groaned, then splintered, the lockjam exploding inward. The sound of that splintering wood was the sound of liberation. I found Ethan on the floor, huddled against the far wall, a portrait of utter despair. And in that moment, he wasn't just my son. He was a victim of a crime in progress. This was no longer about a divorce. This was a rescue. Stepping back into that courthouse was like walking into my own past. The smell hit me first, that unique combination of old oak polish, dusty legal tomes, and the faint electric tang of human stress. It hadn't changed in 15 years. I wasn't wearing an old suit. I had on my Carhartt jacket, a pair of worn Levi's 505s, and my Red Wing boots. I wanted the jury, the judge, everyone, to see me not as the lawyer I once was, but as the man I am now. A father. A craftsman. Chloe's lawyer, Jennifer Rivers, a sharp-looking woman in a suit that probably cost more than my truck, sized me up with an expression of thinly veiled contempt. She saw an old man, out of his depth, playing at a game he no longer understood. She couldn't see the banked embers of the old fire inside me, waiting for a breath of air to roar back to life. As I'd anticipated, their strategy wasn't to argue the facts. It was to assassinate my character. Jennifer Rivers stood before the court and delivered a polished, cutting monologue about my disgraced career, how I had fled from the justice system under a cloud of failure. Her words were designed to paint me as a bitter, washed-up old man, a vindictive father-in-law, using his son's divorce to settle old scores. I stood at my table and let her speak. I didn't object. I let her words, sharp and poisonous, hang in the air. I looked at the faces of the jury, then at Judge Morales. His expression was unreadable. I knew that the truth has a weight and a gravity all its own. And the truth about my past, just like the truth about Chloe's present, would eventually find its own level. The more dirt you pile on top of it, the bigger the eruption when it finally breaks through. When my turn came, I walked slowly to the lectern. I didn't refute her claims. I confirmed them. "Yes," I said, my voice steady and clear, carrying to the back of the room. "It's true. I walked away from my career as a prosecutor." A murmur went through the courtroom. Then I told them the story I had carried in silence for 15 years. I told them about my last case, prosecuting a powerful man for murder. I told them about the judge who had been bribed, about the evidence that was tampered with. I told them about the late-night phone calls, the veiled threats against Mary and a young Ethan. I told them about the impossible choice I faced, stay and fight a system that was corroded from the inside out, or walk away to protect the only thing that truly mattered. I chose my family. I didn't run from justice, I concluded, my eyes locked on Judge Morales. I ran from corruption. I did it to preserve the only justice I had left to me, my honor and my family. The room was utterly still. I had taken the very weapon they had aimed at my heart and reforged it into a shield. Throughout my account, Judge Morales had remained impassive, his hands steepled before him. He was known for his stoicism, a man who rarely betrayed emotion. But when I finished, he held my gaze for a long, heavy moment. Then, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture so minute that the court reporter probably missed it. But I saw it. And I knew, from the flicker of annoyance on her face, that Jennifer Rivers saw it too. It wasn't bias. It was professional respect. It was acknowledgement from a man who knew the treacherous currents of the world I had escaped. That single silent gesture shifted the balance of power in the room. It was a non-verbal ruling that the testimony of Frankie Parker was to be taken seriously. The first major crack in Chloe's carefully constructed reality had appeared. That night, for the first time in months, Ethan and I sat together in my living room, the warmth of the fireplace pushing back the evening chill. And he talked. He really talked. The words came out in a torrent, a flood of pain and humiliation held back for too long. He told me about the constant, soul-destroying insults, the shoves that were disguised as accidents, the calculated neglect. Each story was a fresh wound, but it was also a brick. We were building our case, our foundation of truth, one painful memory at a time. I took out a yellow legal pad the way I used to and began to write. Dates, times, specifics. The Hammer of Justice moniker wasn't because I was a courtroom brawler. It was because I was meticulous. I built my cases with such overwhelming detailed evidence that they became structurally unsound for the opposition. I would do the same thing now. I would use that same methodical patience to dismantle Chloe's world of lies. The official legal battle was just getting started, but the more important battle, the one to reclaim my son, felt like it was finally turning in our favor. My first witness was Mrs. Henderson, the widow from across the street. She was a sweet church-going woman, and initially she was terrified to get involved. "It's a family matter," she kept saying. But when I sat with her at her kitchen table, over cups of weak tea, and showed her the photographs of Ethan's bruised back, her civic duty overcame her fear. On the stand, her voice trembled at first, but she found her strength. She told the court about hearing Chloe's screaming tirades through her open windows late at night. She described in damning detail one afternoon when she witnessed Chloe deliberately kick Ethan's crutch just out of his reach as he struggled to get up from a lawn chair. Her testimony wasn't a silver bullet, but it was a powerful blow. It methodically chipped away at the facade of the devoted, put-upon wife, revealing the petty, cruel woman underneath. Next, I called the young ER doctor. He strode to the witness box with an air of quiet professionalism, Ethan's medical file in hand. He wasn't emotional or accusatory. He was a man of science. He explained to the jury, using simple, clear language, the difference between the random patterns of bruising from a fall and the distinct parallel contusions that indicate being struck with an object. He put the x-rays up on the screen, pointing out the improperly healed rib, a silent testament to a previous unreported injury. Medical evidence is a formidable weapon because it is impartial. It is the truth stripped of all emotion. When Jennifer Rivers tried to dismiss his testimony as mere speculation, the doctor calmly adjusted his glasses. "With all due respect, counselor," he replied, his voice even, "medicine is not speculative. It is diagnostic, and the diagnosis here is a consistent pattern of physical battery." But I knew the case would hinge on my final witness. Lily. Chloe and her lawyer fought with everything they had to keep her off the stand, wrapping their arguments in the sanctimonious language of protecting a child from psychological trauma. The hypocrisy was galling. The real trauma was the war zone Chloe had turned their home into. The legal debate was intense, but Judge Morales saw through the charade. He ordered a private session in his chambers with a court-appointed child psychologist present. His reasoning was simple and profound. "This court," he declared, his voice resonating with authority, "has a duty to the truth from whatever credible source it may come. And sometimes the most credible witnesses are the smallest." The judge's chambers were a world away from the confrontational theater of the courtroom. The room was paneled in dark wood lined with books, Lily sat in a small chair, clutching a worn teddy bear so tightly her knuckles were white. Her eyes darted constantly to her mother. Chloe was staring at her, a look of pure ice, a silent, menacing command. The psychologist, a gentlewoman with a kind face, was brilliant. She didn't ask a single question about the case. She talked about school, about Lily's favorite Disney princess. Slowly, painstakingly, she drew Lily out of her shell. Finally, the judge leaned forward. "Lily, honey," he asked, his voice soft, "have you ever seen your daddy fall down?" Lily nodded, a tiny, jerky motion. "Can you tell me what happened?" Lily looked at her mother, then at me. I could see the terror and confusion warring in her small face. She took a shuddering breath, buried her face in her teddy bear for a second, and then whispered a sentence that changed everything. "Mommy pushed him." That whisper detonated in the silent room with the force of a confession. In that moment, Chloe's entire, carefully constructed universe of lies, deceit, and manipulation imploded. She erupted, screaming that Lily was lying, that I had brainwashed her. But it was far too late. The truth, spoken with the unassailable innocence of a child, had been set free. Judge Morales looked at Chloe, and for the first time I saw his professional mask slip. His expression was one of pure, undisguised disgust. He didn't raise his voice. He simply motioned to the bailiff. It was over. I crossed the room to Lily, knelt down, and gathered her into my arms. She was trembling uncontrollably. "You did the right thing, sweetheart," I whispered into her hair. "You were so brave." In that moment, holding my granddaughter, I wasn't a lawyer. I wasn't the hammer of justice. I was just a grandfather, trying to build a shield around a little girl who had seen too much. Looking at her, so small and fragile, it hit me that the house Ethan had built wasn't just an asset in a divorce proceeding. It was supposed to be her sanctuary. It was the physical embodiment of the legacy of safety and love we wanted to give her. For those of you who've spent a lifetime building something for your family, would you agree that protecting the memories and the very spirit of a home is more important than its market value? I'd be interested to know what you think. After Lily's testimony, Chloe knew she was beaten. The night before the judge was to deliver his final ruling, she appeared on my front porch. The arrogant, sharp-edged woman was gone, replaced by a desperate, unraveling stranger. She was sobbing, pleading with me to drop the charges. She offered up a pathetic collection of excuses. It was the stress. She still loved Ethan. She even offered to sign over the house, free and clear, if I would just convince the DA not to pursue the criminal case. Listening to her, I didn't feel a shred of triumph, only a deep, weary sadness. Her tears weren't for the pain she'd caused. They were for herself. She wasn't sorry for her actions. She was terrified of their consequences. "Chloe," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding, "you didn't do this because you were stressed. You did this because it is who you are. And my son and my granddaughter, they deserve to be safe from you." I closed the door, not with a slam of anger, but with the quiet finality of a book being closed for the last time. On the day of the verdict, the courtroom was standing room only. The story had leaked out. Neighbors, old co-workers of Ethan's, even some of my own former colleagues from the DA's office were there. They weren't there for the spectacle. They were there for support. When Ethan walked in, using a simple cane now, a quiet dignity about him, a ripple of respect went through the room. Judge Morales entered and wasted no time. He read his ruling in a clear, decisive voice. The divorce was granted on grounds of extreme cruelty. Full legal and physical custody of Lily was awarded to Ethan. The house was declared Ethan's sole and separate property. A permanent restraining order was issued against Chloe. And then the final, decisive blow. The judge announced he was formally referring the entire case file, the medical reports, the financial statements, and the transcript of Lily's testimony, to the district attorney's office, with his strongest recommendation for the immediate pursuit of felony domestic battery charges. Chloe didn't scream or cry. She just seemed to deflate, slumping in her chair like a marionette with its strings cut. Her game was over. But the room didn't erupt in cheers. There was just a profound, collective sigh of relief. Real justice, I've found, is rarely loud. It's the quiet that follows a storm. It's the simple, clean feeling of a wrong being righted. Ethan turned to me, and on his face was a smile I hadn't seen in years. It was tired, and it was bruised around the edges, but it was unmistakably real. No words were necessary. We had walked through the fire together and had come out the other side. As we were leaving, Judge Morales was waiting in the corridor. He strode over and extended his hand. "Frankie," he said, his voice low. "Welcome back." I shook it. It was a firm, solid grip. "I'm not back, Judge," I said. "I just did what a father had to do." He clapped me on the shoulder. "You're a good father, Frankie, and for what it's worth, you were one hell of a prosecutor." Coming from him, the words were a balm on old wounds. It felt like a kind of absolution, a closing of a circle I never thought would be closed. I hadn't failed my calling after all. I'd just answered a higher one. The three of us, me, Ethan, and Lily, stepped out of the courthouse and into the bright afternoon sun. It felt like emerging from a long, dark cave. A small crowd of our neighbors and friends was there on the steps. They enveloped us, not with prying questions, but with quiet hugs and pats on the back. Mrs. Henderson gave Lily a small stuffed bear. One of Ethan's old crew members pressed a cold bottle of water into his hand. It was the simple, powerful language of community. They had seen the truth, and they had shown up. Watching my son and granddaughter being held in that small, strong circle of ordinary, decent people, I knew with absolute certainty that we were going to be all right. The healing would be a long road, but we wouldn't have to walk it alone. We had won back more than just a house. We had won back our place in the world. That first weekend of freedom, I went over to Ethan's. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, every room saturated with the memory of pain and fear. "All right," I said, rolling up my sleeves as I walked through the door. "Let's get this place breathing again." We threw open every window, letting a strong cross breeze sweep through, carrying the scent of cut grass and chasing out the stale air of misery. Our first task was a purge. We systematically went through the house, collecting every trace of Chloe. Her clothes, her cloying perfumes, the cold, impersonal furniture she'd bought. We filled black contractor bags until they were bulging. This wasn't just cleaning, it was a ritual. It was an exorcism. With every bag we hauled to the curb, the house felt lighter, brighter. We were reclaiming it, inch by inch, turning a prison cell back into a sanctuary. Lily was a timid little ghost in the house at first. She moved cautiously, spoke in whispers, as if afraid a loud noise might shatter the fragile new peace. But as she watched her father start to move with more confidence, as the house filled with the sound of my oldies station on the radio instead of shouting, she began to unfurl. We spent an entire Saturday repainting her bedroom. We covered the somber gray Chloe had insisted on with a vibrant, cheerful sky blue. At one point, I got a smudge of blue paint on her nose, and she let out a peal of laughter, a real, uninhibited, joyous sound. In that moment, that simple sound felt more significant than the judge's verdict. It was the sound of a childhood being reclaimed. It was the sound of healing. Ethan still couldn't do heavy work, but he started spending his afternoons with me in my wood shop. He'd sit on a stool, methodically sanding small blocks of maple wood, the rhythmic rasp of the sandpaper a soothing counterpoint to the hum of my machines. We didn't rehash the past. We talked about the future, about projects, about rebuilding the back deck, about designing a treehouse for Lily, for men like us, working with our hands, bringing order and form to a raw piece of wood, is a language all its own. It's a tangible way of processing the intangible. It's a reminder that even when things feel shattered beyond repair, you still possess the power to build again. One of the first pieces of furniture we hauled out of the house was the living room sofa, the one where Ethan had been forced to sit night after night, absorbing Chloe's verbal assaults. A few days later, I drove him to a furniture store. "Pick one out, son," I said, "the most comfortable one you can find." He gravitated toward a big, overstuffed leather recliner, a classic lazy boy, almost identical to my own. When it was delivered and set in the place of honor in the living room, he sank into it, tilted it back, and let out a long, shuddering sigh of pure relief. It was more than a chair. It was a throne. It was a declaration of his right to comfort, his right to rest, his status as the undisputed master of his own home. It was his new command center. One evening, while we were watching a ball game, his phone buzzed on the end table. It was an unknown number. He glanced at it, then at me. A flicker of the old tension passed between us. We both knew who it was. Chloe, or one of her lawyers, probing for a weakness. A few months ago, that sound would have made him flinch. He would have been filled with dread, but this time he just looked at the screen dispassionately for a moment, then pressed the red icon to decline the call. He set the phone face down without a word and turned his attention back to the game. There was no anger, no drama, just a quiet, profound finality. He was free. Her power over him had been severed. Silence was no longer her weapon to inflict upon him. It was now his choice to grant. The local paper ran a small follow-up piece on the case. It wasn't front-page news, just a few paragraphs in the Metro section. But someone read it. A few weeks later, a plain white envelope arrived in my mail with no return address. Inside was a single page of lined paper, covered in neat block handwriting. It was from a man I'd never met. He told me his story, a narrative that was a chilling echo of Ethan's. A husband and father, trapped in a psychologically and physically abusive marriage, suffocating in a prison of silence and shame. He wrote that reading about Ethan's case had given him the courage to make a single phone call to his older brother, a man he hadn't spoken to in years, and for the first time, tell him the truth. The letter ended with a simple, powerful sentence: "Thank you for giving us a voice." I held that piece of paper for a long time. It was then that I truly understood. My son's ordeal wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was a single, visible manifestation of a vast, hidden epidemic of pain. A few days after that, my phone rang. It was a woman from the county's Domestic Violence Support Center. She'd seen the article. She asked if I would consider coming to speak to their men's support group. Not as a lawyer, she was quick to clarify. As a father. She explained, "The men we work with, they're wary of therapists and officialdom, but they might listen to someone like you." My first instinct was to say no. I'm a private man. But then I thought of that letter, of that anonymous voice reaching out from the darkness. "I'll be there," I said. The meeting room was in the basement of a community center. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale, flat light on a circle of a dozen men on folding chairs. They were a mix of ages and backgrounds, but they all shared a common feature: the guarded, weary look of men carrying a heavy, invisible burden. I didn't stand at a lectern. I just pulled up a chair and became part of the circle. I didn't have a speech. I just told them our story. I told them about the bruise on Ethan's arm, about the baseball bat in the closet, about the look of profound shame in my son's eyes. I spoke of a father's helplessness, the unique agony of watching your child suffer and being powerless to stop it. When I finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Then, an older man, a plumber with hands like leather, cleared his throat and began to speak. He talked about his wife's rages, about dodging flying tools in his own garage. Then a younger man, a high school teacher, spoke about having his finances controlled to the penny, about being isolated from his family and friends. One by one, like a dam breaking, they began to share their stories, unleashing floods of pain that had been held back for years. And that sterile basement room was transformed. It was no longer a place of shame. It became a sanctuary, a place of validation. I realized then that the most enduring legacy I could ever leave wouldn't be money or property. It would be this story. It would be the alchemy of turning our private pain into a public source of strength for others. Leaving the center that night, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for years. The legal battle was over, but I now understood that my work was not. Perhaps this was the reason for it all. The legal system I had devoted my life to had ultimately disappointed me. But here, in this circle of broken but healing men, I had found a different, more fundamental kind of justice. A justice built not on statutes but on empathy. I was no longer the hammer of justice, but perhaps I could be a quiet harbor, a small, steady light for other men adrift in the darkness of their own silence, and that, I decided, was a legacy worth a man's life. 6 months after the verdict, Ethan hung up his cane for good. The doctors were clear. The damage to his ankle was permanent, and he'd never be able to handle the grueling physical demands of a construction site again. But he didn't see it as an end. He saw it as a new direction. He enrolled in night classes at the community college, studying construction management. He was determined to repurpose his hard-won knowledge. I would often find him at his kitchen table late at night, surrounded by blueprints and textbooks, the focused, determined look back in his eyes. I saw again the young man who had built this very house, his passion for creation rekindled. Chloe had tried to smother that fire, but she had only succeeded in banking the embers, which were now glowing hotter than ever. One Saturday morning, I awoke him before sunrise. "We're going fishing," I announced. It was our old tradition, one we'd let lapse. We drove out to Miller's Lake, the mist rising off the water like steam. We didn't talk much. We just sat in the boat, casting our lines, sharing a thermos of coffee. The silence between us was different now. It wasn't the heavy, strained silence of unspoken pain. It was an easy, comfortable silence, the kind shared by men who know each other's hearts without needing clumsy words. As the sun climbed higher, Ethan turned to me. "Thanks, Dad," he said quietly. "Not just for the trial, for everything." I just nodded, my throat suddenly thick. That was all that needed to be said. At that moment, his line went taut, and we worked together, father and son, to reel in a beautiful, largemouth bass. The treehouse project for Lily became our focus. I handled the cutting and the heavy framing, while Ethan, putting his new management skills to the test, directed the operation from a patio chair, the blueprint spread across his lap. Lily appointed herself site foreman, busily collecting acorns and colorful leaves for interior decoration. Watching father and daughter work together, I saw a new bond being forged, one built not on a foundation of fear, but on a shared project of joy. Ethan was no longer a victim being shielded. He was a father again, a builder, a creator of happiness for his child. That small structure in the sturdy branches of the old oak tree was more than a playhouse. It was a monument to our family's survival and rebirth. One evening, Ethan told me he had met someone, a physical therapist he'd gotten to know during his recovery. He spoke about her with a hesitant shyness, but there was a genuine light in his eyes, a spark I hadn't seen in a very long time. "She's kind, Dad," was all he said. "She listens." I didn't pry. I just put my hand on his shoulder. "If you're happy, son, then I'm happy." Life, with its incredible stubborn persistence, was moving forward. The heart, I was reminded, is a resilient muscle. No matter how badly it's damaged, it wants to heal. Mary had always believed that. And looking at my son, I was finally starting to believe it again, too. That night, I sat in my armchair, watching the flames in my fireplace cast dancing shadows on the wall. My eyes fell on the mantel, on the row of framed photographs. There was a new one there, at the very end. It was a picture I'd taken just last week. The three of us, me, Ethan, and Lily, standing proudly in front of the finished treehouse. We were all laughing. Our smiles weren't the perfect, carefree smiles of a family untouched by hardship. They were deeper than that. They were etched with the lines of worry and the memory of pain, but they were real. And it occurred to me then that a family isn't something that's unbreakable. A family is something that has the incredible capacity to rebuild itself, to become stronger in the very places where it was broken. And that, I thought, is the only legacy worth leaving. People are fond of saying that silence is golden, but I've come to learn that there are two kinds of silence, and one of them is leaden. There's the silence of shame and fear, the heavy, toxic silence that nearly cost me my son. It's a wall that isolates you, that leaves you to drown in your own pain. But there's another kind of silence, the quiet concentration of a craftsman focused on his work. The comfortable quiet of a father and son sharing a boat at sunrise. That is the silence of strength, of understanding, of presence. We men, we are taught to value that second kind of silence, but we too often find ourselves trapped in the first. We need to learn to tell the difference, because in true, strong silence, you can hear the things that matter most. I spent the better part of my adult life pursuing justice within the four walls of a courtroom. But I see now that justice is a much bigger, more complex thing. Sometimes it's a verdict from a judge. But sometimes, justice is the sound of a child's laughter echoing in a backyard. Sometimes it's a quiet nod of recognition from a stranger who understands your pain. And sometimes, justice is as simple and as profound as being able to wake up in the morning, look at your own reflection in the mirror, and not feel ashamed. A courtroom can right a legal wrong, but only love and patience can heal a wounded soul. That's the most important lesson this old man has learned. My generation was raised on a clear set of instructions for fatherhood. Provide, protect, be the unwavering pillar of strength, and there is truth and honor in all of that. But I've learned that sometimes the most critical part of the job is simply to be present, to sit in the dark with your child and just listen, even when, and especially when, no words are being spoken, to let them know that no matter how many times they stumble, your hand will be there to help them up, not to solve their problems for them, but to be a steady, unwavering reminder that they are not and will never be alone. That is not weakness. That is the foundation, the bedrock upon which everything else is built. So if you're listening to this story, and if it resonates in some quiet corner of your own life, I just want to leave you with this thought. Do not be afraid to speak your truth. Do not be afraid to ask for help. True strength isn't measured by how much you can endure alone. It is measured by the courage it takes to admit that you need another person, a friend, a brother, a father. There are people in your life who want to help. You just have to give them the chance. Don't let the silence of shame have the last word. Choose the silence of strength. Well, It's about time for me to go. The fire in the hearth is burning down to embers. Ethan and Lily will be here soon for dinner. The future is an unknown road. Life always has another surprise waiting around the bend. But I know one thing with a certainty that settles deep in my bones. Whatever comes next, we will face it together. A fire can die down, but as long as there are a few glowing embers left, you can always, always coax it back into a flame. Thanks for listening to my story. Take care of yourselves and the ones you love. So long.